The 47th sequel by Christopher Amos Chikomeko, the producer, in this series of the Church of Uganda at 150, a celebration of our history, of course, making awareness. The celebration is only 4 years away. Today's sequel, specifically looking at the deadly fight in the Swamps of Kyoga that ended up with the arrest or the capture of both kings, Mwanga and Kabarega. Very important, I need to appreciate a writer called Samuel Runyigo for his book Mwanga II, because in all the books I've read, is the only one who has ever brought up this research, that it was not a mere arrest, or it was not a mere capture. There was a deadly war that ended up in the capture of these two great men. And so the sequel begins. In April 1899, the war against Mwanga and Kabarega began in the swamps. Remember, the Punjabi or the Punjani forces were already on the ground. They had taken over the counties of Bunyoro, neighboring Bunyoro, Bururi, Bulemezi, and parts of Singo. The note which Mwanga II had sent to Apollo Kagwa, remember the courier who was very stupid to go back to the direction of Lango swamps, so where Mwanga was very clear. Perhaps maybe they didn't know about Kabarega. Now the Bururi county chief Andrea Luwandaga and the Bukedi chief Semei Kakunguru opened up communication with the Lango native chiefs and got accurate information as to the whereabouts of Mwanga II and Kabarega. So this is the betrayal. The betrayal is not about Semei Kakunguru, who was already in the employment of the Europeans. Neither was Andrea Luwandaga, who was the chief in the government of Buganda. But the betrayal was the Lango chief. The Lango chief were supposed to have secretly guarded and kept the two fugitive kings, but now they give them up. They give information as exactly where they are. Now the Indian Punjani troops began to amass in Bururi after it was realized that close to 500 armed soldiers guarded the runaway kings. So all this information the Langi chiefs gave to Semei Kakunguru and the Bururi chief Andrea Luwandaga. So the war resumed. This time, the resumption of the war, it is not Africans who are fighting, it's Punjani troops, the Indians. And so on the 9th of April, 1899, in the swamps of Lango, in Yombo County of Lango, the war began. And remember, on the other side, the people who are guarding the two kings are the Nubians now. Yeah, the Nubians have joined. They have always been in the camps. They don't have a home, remember. They ran away from Southern Sudan, or they were brought from Southern Sudan. Their home is Bombo. Their home is Fort Jerry in Port Poto in Toro. Their home is Jinja. Their home is Kibera. And so they have no home. They are now in the swamps and they have to fight for their dear life. Now the casualties on both sides were immense. Bakulembeze, a soldier attached to Andrea Luwandaga, was ordered to get Semei Kakunguru from the front line. And led by Chief Kutu, they headed for Amolata. Amolata is in Yombo County. And on the 18th of April, 1899, Bakulembeze was the first to spot Mwanga, armed at the Kitosi River. With him, soldiers ran, but soon realized that they were surrounded, and so they surrendered. "I am Mwanga, don't shoot me," he shouted, with his hands and gun up. His commander, Gabriel Chintu, was nowhere to be seen. Remember, Now we know that he had been jailed by the Germans. So those who had always thought that Gabo Chintu is with Mwanga were disappointed. Gabo Chintu was in the hands of the Germans in Tanganyika. And so the combat continued. It doesn't mean that because Mwanga was arrested, so the combat ended. The combat continued. The battle in the swamps of River Kitosi in Amola Lango was deadly, according to Ham Mukasa, writing in the unpublished Simuda Nyoma Part 2 and Part 3 on page 541. Papers I've seen myself and read myself at the Makerere University archives. Those were never published. He says that there were up to 350 casualties as Mwanga and Kabarega, fully armed, fought off the attack by the British troops, of course the Punjani troops, in their hideout. Casualties died from bullets, spears, and by drowning in the swamp. Remember, this was a swamp, and a very big swamp because it's a lake swamp. Now, Chief Kutu had betrayed the runaway kings in their hideout to the Semeika Kungulu-led British troops platoon. Kabarega was shot in his right arm and got severely injured on the 18th of April, 1899. But before he surrendered, he looked at his captor, one soldier called Isaac, a soldier attached to Semeika Kungulu, and he looked at him with rage and contempt. Kabarega's son, Jassa, who was his aide de camp in the hideout, died of his wounds. Both the kings were captured and taken to Chikabukabu, where they met the British soldier, Major Tannen and Colonel Everett. The chiefs Andere Rwandaga and Semeika Kunguru came along, and they spent there 3 days to allow communication reach Kampala and later Zanzibar. Then the prisoners began to be moved to Kaga, then to Makitwe, then to Mukula, into Bululi County, with 586 stolen cattle to the county capital, Kisarizi. Whereas some Punjani Indian troops stayed with Colonel Everett in Bululi, at least 40 Indian Punjani soldiers began the journey for Mengo with the prisoners, with Semeika Kungulu in the lead. The heavily guarded royal prisoners reached Kirinda, Warigabi, Kamuwanula, Kalagala, Chitezi, Kazo, Thurubwaise to Makerere, and to Fort Lugard, where they arrived on the 11th of May, 1899. Now, Bishop Tucker, in his memoirs, said that the natives were very worried about what awaited the captured Kabakas, Wandomukama, fearing they would be hanged. So the bishop also went to Fort Lugard on the 11th of May, 1899, to have a glance at the prisoners he had never met. Yeah, he had never met, where major, meaning he had never met actually Kabarega. But as far as Mwanga is concerned, the bishop had met Mwanga, had been with Mwanga for a long time, but he had never met Kabarega. Now, Major Tannen had received them and pronounced the punishment as deportation, not hanging. The bishop went on record that the Christian natives he knew welcomed the deportation instead of the death penalty. And he writes in his book that the natives said, Katonda ebale, that thank God they reacted. All this time, the right hand of Kabarega had been amputated. It was shot badly. He was very far away from Mengo Hospital. So the only way they could save his life was to amputate the arm. That's why you see in the pictures, those of you who can monitor, the pictures where Mwanga is standing with Kabarega and Punjani Sodia in the middle. When you look at Kabarega's right hand, you see, you will not see the hand. Whereas you can comfortably see the left hand, you cannot see the right hand. It is not that it's inside his clothes. No, it had been amputated to save his life. Because, why? Apparently he refused to surrender. Yeah, he was speaking with his captors with wreck. On the 11th of May 1899, the day that they arrived at Fort Lugard on Unkao Hill, it rained, and it really rained cats and dogs. These things makes me wonder how God acts, because this is a day where crowds are supposed to gather, and now look, it is raining cats and dogs. But anyway, despite the heavy rains, still crowds gathered. And when they gathered, it was not to show sadness. No, it was to cheer their captured gallant kings. Can you imagine? The people were cheering them on. I don't know, the language they used was never put down in writing. But they said the natives cheered on their king, cheered on Kabarega, cheered on Mwanga. All that rain ended on the Indian troops and their prisoners. There were no stopping. And I've already described the route they took on their way to Fort Lugard. So from Fort Lugard, through the Kisenyi residence of Elia Kajiri, it used to be called Musigura in those days. Then to Wansaso, and Wansaso is one of the gates of the Mengo Palace of Mwanga, and on to Munyonyo Port. Yeah, the number of Indian Punjani soldiers was increased from 40 to 100. And these were to guard the two fugitive kings from Port Lugard to Munyonyo. They indeed accompanied them all the way up to Munyonyo. Now, the two concubines from Mwanga were added on the party. Salima and Bakazi Kubao, while the male servants, Yusuf Mwanjare and Petero Balizakiwa, joined the group heading for exile. Adere Chiwanuka had instructions to accompany the group, but only up to Munyonyo. So did Semeika Kunguru. You remember he had to return to Mengo and assure Apollo Kagwa that the ex-kings had gone into Clement Hill ship, the ship that was to take them to Kavirondo's Port Florence, which we now call Kisumu. That is the sequel that describes what happened when Mwanga was captured. Tomorrow's sequel, we shall discover what happened next. May the good Lord bless us up.